All right, welcome everybody to our meeting this week. Hopefully, if you're watching this, then you're definitely watching the meetings. I think they're really helpful. I'm not sure how else to say that. Maybe I'll send an email. I think they help a lot. But this week is on memory, and this builds off of quite a bit from what we did last week. Because if you remember, I kind of did some study skills stuff, and I based that off of memory. So you're kind of going to get two sets of memory stuff, which I think will be helpful because this one can be complicated, but not impossible. So let me share my screen with you guys. All right. So this chapter focuses on a whole branch of psychology called cognitive psychology. And cognitive has a bunch of kind of facets to it. There's a big clinical component, meaning a part of cognitive psychology that's tied to like doing therapy. And then the bulk of this field in psychology is how we acquire, organize, remember, and use information. So a lot of what the cognitive researchers focus on is just like how we understand memory and what kinds of things mess with it, right? Like how we forget things and why we forget things and what kinds of things, factors would impact our ability to remember stuff. So if you guys can, take out a piece of paper really fast. Just make it into two columns. So column one is going to be like a recall. So you're going to have to just remember without any cues. And then the column two will be recognition. So I'll give you some cues to remember, remember this information. The test is basically, who are the seven dwarfs? So write down in that first column as many of the seven dwarfs as you can possibly remember. And then the second column, I'll give you a list of potential seven dwarf names, and you can guess which one is the right one. All right, looks like a couple of you are done. So let's do this. Now, here's the next task. Try to pick out from this list which ones of these are the seven dwarfs. So just jot down. In here are seven of them that are right, but a bunch of them are definitely wrong. All right, I think you guys are looking like you're done. Oh, shoot. Okay, so how'd you do? Who thinks they got all seven? Go for it.
I think so.
Yeah, I couldn't tell who raised it. Stacy, maybe Stacy, go.
You want me to tell you who they are?
Yeah.
Sleepy, grouchy, sneezy, grumpy, bashful, happy dog.
I think that sounded right. No, wait, which one did she miss? Andrea, which
I don't think it's grouchy, isn't it grumpy?
Yeah.
Maybe I'm wrong.
Grumpy. I meant grumpy. You're
That's
right.
okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, it's grumpy.
I was gonna say it's not a fair one when you're asking moms, you know. This isn't a fair test.
Grumpy and grouchy. Don't they mean the same thing?
Yeah, same.
It's present. That's awesome. Good. All right. So now think about this for a second. What made this easy to do? What made it hard to do? What things do you think impact your ability to remember this particular thing, these seven dwarfs?
I think the movie for me kind of helped me because I had that imagery in my mind, and so I just went through the different images of who they were.
Okay. So, like thinking back to the movie itself, and having the image of the dwarves in your head sort of made it easier because you could kind of like work your way through them and write them down. Does that sound right, Rach?
Yes.
Yeah. Right. So, what you're really talking about is this thing called priming, where if you prime a specific network, you're going to retain or remember stuff from that network better. There's a principle called the encoding specificity principle, which says the thing that you use to remember this the first time around is going to be the best cue later on, and that's perfect, right? Because you probably used the image of the dwarves. That's what you used to help remember. Stace, how about you? What made this easier or harder for you?
Probably because I was thinking of the song. You hear it, and so like there was a couple that I forgot, but as soon as I saw the name, I remembered. Oh, that's it.
Okay. So another piece. I think there's a song that goes with the Seven Dwarfs names. I did not know that. That's good.
Well, I mean, I guess you hear like there. I don't know. I guess in my mind there was like kind of a tune to it.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure there could be. I for a really long time, but so then it kind of like Rachel, the tune sort of primes or cues the memories to come back a bit. You also talked about how the recognition task is a ton easier. Why, Stace? Why is the recognition seeing and then why does that make it easier?
Probably because I couldn't think at the top of my head what it was, but as soon as I saw it, I remembered.
Yeah, right. Again, like those words cued you and cued the right one. But what was interesting, let's assume for a second that you got it wrong. You said grouchy instead of grumpy, which is really common, right? Because we have this thing called a semantic network, right? That's a network that we use to remember information, and we code information that's similar into the same semantic network. So grouchy and grumpy are probably going to be in the same semantic network. And if that's the case, when you cue that network, that's going to be a commonly like wrong answer for a lot of people because they're so close together.
Yeah, interesting.
Good. How about you, Andrea? What made this easier or harder?
Well, for me, I've got 3 girls, and they've watched these movies a million times over, and then we've talked about it, so I could name them off the top of my head, just right off the start. Basic, just plain old repetition. My girls in the car, name all the dwarves, and many times. But then seeing them was like, oh, good, yep, I got them right, or ones I wasn't sure of.
So what you're talking about is this idea that we have called mastery learning, right? When you repeat it so many times, like it is like indelibly imprinted in the network in your head, you're never going to forget it, right? You could probably rattle these off in high stress situations, no problem. And that repetition is what creates the strength of that semantic network and makes it easier to recall it. So like that's a huge part, right? And then if you tie it back to really specific memories, that makes a big difference as well. So these are great. I think probably like time, this third one down here is something that Andrea benefited from and Rachel and Stacey may have had a harder time with, simply because like the distance from when you learned it till you have to recall it makes a big difference. And we talked about that a little bit last week. We know that when you refresh it or repeat the information to yourself again, then you retain it even longer over time. But time is a huge factor as far as our ability to remember stuff. This idea that it's inconsequential information, I think, is pretty important. Rach, what do you think that means?
She has her thing on mute.
Oh.
Sorry.
There we go.
Maybe because it's not really something needed for everyday life. It's just a part that happened a while ago.
Yeah, and that's important, and that's kind of that repetition piece. If you were using the names of the 7 doors, like maybe you make them your passwords, that'd be cool. Use them every day. That would make a huge difference, and so it's not kind of relevant or important. And even more than that, in the movie itself, like their names don't really matter. they're not super, super necessary to really get the whole point of the movie kind of a thing. So that's important. We have inconsequential information that we're bombarded with on a daily basis. And it's kind of nice that our brains, they don't retain that stuff because it doesn't matter, right? There's this thing called eidetic memory where people remember all that stuff. And if you think about it, in a lot of ways, it's kind of annoying, right? Because it's the rare person. In fact, it's even argued that it doesn't really exist. But if it did, and you could remember what I wore 10 years from now today, that'd be, like, who cares, right? Like, we don't need to know what Hatch wore or what Stacy was wearing or what Andrea was wearing, right? That doesn't make any difference. So it's kind of nice that we sort of filter out inconsequential stuff and we don't remember those things. But that sets us up to have all kinds of problems come. We rely on these semantic networks, we call them schemas, to fill in the gaps of inconsequential information, and that makes our memories really, really vulnerable to suggestion and to our later experiences. That makes us go back and like forget stuff. So let's keep going here though. I think this is an interesting piece, like the similar sounds, and it may have happened to Stacy, where grouchy and grumpy are so close together that it cues the right network, but you just pick the wrong word because it's so close to the right one. Yeah. And then everybody remembers stuff better when it's recognition, when there's a cue of some kind versus recall. That's why, like, I make my upper division classes take tests that are all fill in the blank tests, and they freaking hate them, right? Because there's nothing to cue you to the right answer. Whereas multiple choice tests, one of the four has to be right? One of those four choices has got to be right. So it makes them a bit easier that way. This just illustrates that difference between recognition and recall. And it's big, right? We can recall stuff with reminders a lot easier than we can without any reminders. So what I want to talk about now, it's called the modal model of memory. And it's a really useful way, I think, to consider all the different kind of components that are at play as far as memory goes. So we're going to start with this first part, sensory memory. And so kind of broadly speaking, some kind of event information comes in through our senses, and then it gets encoded into working memory. And that's the part of our brain where we're kind of like actively processing stuff. And if we process it a lot, then it gets encoded into long term. And then when we need that information later, then it comes back into working memory through a retrieval process of some kind. And I think if you look at these encoding arrows, there's a big part, right? So sensory memory encoding here is done through attention. And then in working memory, the encoding is done through repetition. So those kind of two different components are really important. But let's talk about sensory memory just for a second. And we're going to go through how big, like what's the capacity of our sensory memory and how long does information last in our sensory memory. So like capacity and duration are kind of like the two pieces that we're going to hit. And this study isn't super old, but it's actually really interesting. So Sperling in 1960 did this. He would flash these 9 letters for 1/20th of a second, like just super fast enough that you could still see it, but so fast that it really is just a flash really in your sensory memory. And when he asked people then after he flashed it for these 50 milliseconds to write down as many letters as they could, almost everybody could get about 4 of the letters, right? They all got about 44% of the letters. And the recall would happen just immediately after he would flash it, so really, really quick afterwards. And then he did this next kind of like part of the study, which I think is the interesting piece. He said, I'm going to flash this for the same amount of time, but right afterwards, I'm going to ring a bell. There's going to be 3 possible tones, a low tone, a medium tone, or a high tone. And whichever one of the 3 that I ring, that tells you which line I want you to recall. Does that make sense? So if he flashes this and he rings the medium tone, then Andrea, what is it? Andrea. Okay. Andrea. I got it. Andrea, he's going to ring, then you would have to recall if he rings the medium tone, which letters?
JRS.
Yeah. And Andrea, if he does the high tone, then you're going to do?
The PKY.
Exactly. Right now, before when he flashed this for the exact same amount of time, everybody could get four letters. This time you only had to get 3, but you didn't know which 3 of the 9 you were going to get. And when he did this, it didn't matter which tone that he rang. Everybody could get 100% of the letters. So it's interesting, right? This tells us some stuff. As you look at this, and just take a guess, because it's kind of tricky, but what does this tell us about sensory memory? If before, with all 9, I could only get 4, but now, if I'm cued to which row of letters I need, I can get all of them every time. What might this mean, do you think?
Is it because you know what to block out?
Yeah. So there's possibly a bit about that, right? It's not so much about blocking out, but directing our attention to the thing that matters.
Okay.
So you're on the right track, right? I think it has massive ramifications, because essentially you have all 9 of them. You have access to all 9 letters. He just directed your attention to one row, to 3 of them. But again, it didn't matter which tone he rang, you got all of them. So what that means is our sensory memory is massive. We take in everything that we see and everything that we hear. It just doesn't last very long, right? In this case, we took it all in and we could only get about 4. In this case, we took it all in again. And if we were cued to which row we needed to spit out again, we'd get it 100% correct. It didn't matter which row it was asked of us. So you can see it's in our sensory memory, and then it goes from our sensory memory unless we do what?
Focus on it. Think about it.
Exactly, Andrew. Right? If you pay attention to it, it's going to stay in your working memory. It gets shifted from sensory memory into working memory, and you start thinking about it. You're focusing on it. It's exactly right. But for those seconds, you've got everything that you've heard and seen in your sensory memory. And the thing that gets it from sensory memory into working memory is what we focus on, what we pay attention to. So then he kept going with this, right? Then he did the same set of letters. This is a different set, but he had a time delay, and then he did the low, medium, and high tone. And the time delay was a couple of seconds, right? About 3 or so seconds. And in this case, what happened is the people only got 1 of the letters in each row, depending on whichever tone was rung. So what that tells us again is that it's in our sensory memory, but it goes away super fast. It's inconsequential information. And the way our brain knows it's inconsequential information is because we didn't what? Say it louder.
Or focus on it?
Yeah, we didn't focus on it. Yeah, perfect. Right? So then what we see when we try to measure sensory memory is that it doesn't last very long. After about a second, we only have about 25% of whatever we've seen or heard in our sensory memory. And we could even get more specific, because it's different depending on the sense that we have. If it's visual, it only lasts in our sensory memory for half a second. If it's hearing, it lasts 3 to 4 seconds. And then, I don't know why we even do this one, but if you touch it, it lasts less than a second. So just forget about that one. But it's kind of cool, right? That means that I see something and I'm retaining 100% of it for about half a second. And if I hear something, I'm retaining it 100% for about 3 to 4 seconds. So what this means then is, and I bet you've had this happen, let's say that Rachel is talking with her mom, right? And when you're a teenager, I bet this happened. At some point, your mom's like, Rach, you're not even listening to me. And when that happens, Rachel, what did you usually say right back to her?
Yes, I am.
Yep. And then she's like, whatever, you're not. Prove it to me. And then what would you do?
Repeat exactly what she just said.
You would repeat specifically the last what?
The last 3 seconds.
The last
word.
Yeah, because not just the last word, the last 3 to 4 seconds of it, right? And that took zero effort, because you always retain the last 3 to 4 seconds of whatever it is that you just heard without any effort, because you don't even have to pay attention to it. But if your mom really wanted to know, Rach, if you were paying attention, what should she have done?
Ask what the concept that she was talking about was.
Yeah, what did I say 7 seconds ago, or even 6 seconds ago? And then you'd have been like, I have no idea. because we retain all of it. Now, here's I think the even more interesting part. I bet this has happened as well. Andrea, let's say Andrea's at a party, right? And basically what we've just got done saying is that everything that Andrea hears and sees is retained in her sensory memory. If it's visually, for just half a second. If it's hearing, it's 3 to 4 seconds. But that means she's processing at some level literally everything that's being said or done at that party that she can physically hear. So she's in a relatively small room, but there might be like 20 people in it. She's processing at some level 100% of what everybody is saying. Now, how could we possibly know that? What do you think, Andrea?
Well, because I think we've all been there where we're in tune in one conversation and then we hear something from another that diverts our attention. So we obviously were listening to that other conversation, but it just took something to be like, wait a minute, our name or something like that.
And the name is the most common thing, right? We call it the cocktail party phenomenon. But you're sitting there talking with your friend, totally focused on what she or he might be saying. What if someone says Andrea? Suddenly your attention goes, right? And you're just focused on what they're saying because that matters. If someone said snake, probably the same thing would happen, right? Or fire, or that looks like smoke, or is that blood spurting out of his arm, right? All those things where you'd be like, and that tells us that you're still processing those 3 to 4 seconds in echoic memory, right? In your hearing, which is kind of cool. So if you look at this next slide, how big should this sensory input arrow actually be, Stace?
The sensory input?
Yeah, this arrow, if it was proportionate to how much we're actually taking in, it should be how big, do you think?
So probably the 3 to 4 seconds.
Well, that's how long it lasts.
Oh.
Take in what?
Yeah.
Everything. So this arrow should be ginormous. It should be huge because everything's coming through. It just doesn't last there very long.
Okay.
The only things that last, that's what this arrow is important, is the stuff that we pay attention to.
Okay.
So the idea of splitting our attention, right? People call this multitasking. It's an absolute myth because we can only really pay attention to one thing. When you quote unquote multitask, essentially what you're doing is paying very specific attention to one thing and then shifting quickly to another thing and then shifting back and forth. So that's why texting and driving is a seriously bad idea because you can't really multitask. For the second that you're looking at your phone, you are not paying attention to driving. And we all know this, right? If, a dog ran out or heaven forbid, a kid or something like that, you would not see it because you are not paying attention to it. Now apply this to a classroom setting. Andrea, go for it. What do you think?
Oh, yeah. I mean, as soon as you start to daydream or focus or, look at your phone in class.
Totally. I mean, that's a great example, right? In that sense, all of those things I think are subtle but super important, right? You look at your phone or even if the professor, she says something super interesting and you're like, oh man, that's really cool. And you start thinking about it. Suddenly you just stopped what?
Yeah, stop
with everybody else.
Yeah, you're not hearing anything else. And if you're not paying attention to whatever she said next or he said next, it is not getting to working memory at all. And then that guarantees that it's not getting into your long-term memory and it will be impossible for you to retrieve it later. So attention seriously matters. It's a big, big deal. So we're going to shift gears now. I'm going to share I'm going to show a video clip really fast. It's awesome. So this one, you may have seen this before, but what you have to do is count the number of passes. They'll tell you. And then I'll pause it, and you just tell me how many passes the team in white makes.
This is an awareness test. How many passes does the team in white make? Go!
All right, how many passes did they make?
11.
13.
13? Yeah, 13's right. Now, here's the important part, and I couldn't tell just by looking at you, but how many of you saw the bear walk in and moonwalk, breakdance and moonwalk? How many of you
No,
saw it?
I didn't see that.
No.
Andrea didn't, Stacy?
Nope.
I didn't.
You didn't see it? So when I do this in a class of about 60 students, there's always about 15 or so, right around 15%, 10% or so that actually see it. But just to prove to you guys that there was a bear, I'll show you the same exact part again. Now, don't count the passes, just watch.
How many passes does the team in white make?
Oh, that's funny.
Oh.
Perfect. All right, so what is this telling us? Rach, what do you think? What does this tell us about our attention and how stuff gets into our working memory?
That if you're not paying attention to certain items, then our mind dismisses it and we don't retain it.
Yeah, it's like you weren't even there. I mean, this is a good, you've seen those bumper stickers probably that say start seeing motorcycles, because that's like such a common thing that people say, I just didn't see him or her. Because if you're not paying attention to it, there's no way it can make it into your working memory. So when we think about the impact of this, just for learning, it's massive, right? Like you could spend a lot of time thinking about things that distract you, whether it's your own thoughts, whether it's the girl or guy in front of you sitting in the classroom, or your phone, or the music that you're listening to, right? Like those are all kind of factors that could distract you potentially and make it so that you cannot retain and use the information that you have. So let's keep going here. Let me share. So there's really cool stuff when we think about attention and sensory memory. So really quick, Stacy, how long does information hearing last in our sensory memory in this area right
Oh, okay, so you want to know how much it's going to last.
here? Yeah, how long does it last? How long does hearing information last?
The hearing, we said 3 to 4 seconds.
Yeah, that's it, right? And you always will get 3 to 4 seconds unless you pay attention to it. And then you have the potential to remember it forever if you rehearse it a long enough time and encode that through rehearsal into your long-term memory. So these arrows, from sensory to working is attention. From working to long-term, basically you could say is rehearsal, right? Just repeating it again and again and again. That's how you memorize stuff. And there's tricks to facilitating how you memorize things. Like if it's very, very meaningful, you'll remember it forever with a lot less effort. But if it's not very meaningful, like it's some algebraic code or some chemistry elements, right? Then it's going to be a lot harder to remember because it's less meaningful to you. Okay, so memory, it actually kind of stinks, and let's talk about why it stinks. This is one of my favorite studies. This researcher's name is Elizabeth Loftus, and she did a really cool study. In this study, she got a group of 120 people who had visited Disneyland or Disney World, and she said, we're going to have you guys participate in this focus group. She divided them into different groups, and then she exposed them to an ad, a fake ad, as it turns out. And in the ad, they said, hey, remember that one time you went to Disney World or Disneyland? What's a common thing that you do, right? Who's been to Disney World or Land fairly recently?
Oh.
Yeah, Stace has. So what's one of the first things the first time you go to Disneyland or World that you do? When you walk through the gates, there's somebody right there. They want to do what with you?
Take your picture.
Yeah, you get a picture with a character, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's exactly what this fake ad was about. It said, hey, do you remember the time you went to Disneyland and got a picture with a character? And of course, everyone says, yeah, I do, because that's how that happens. But in this case, one of the groups was said, hey, you remember that time you went to Disneyland and got a picture with a character, and that character was Bugs Bunny? And they're like, yeah, I totally remember that. As it turns out, about 20% of the people remembered getting a picture with Bugs Bunny. Now, this is impossible. That's why this study works so well. And I can tell that Andrea knows, and Stacy, Stacy knows. I can't see Rachel's face, but Andrea, why? Why is this impossible?
Because Bugs Bunny obviously is not a Disney character.
In fact, Disney would love it if Bugs Bunny had been there, because then they could sue the pants off of Warner Brothers, right? Like, make all kinds of cash. And what's even more interesting is that when they asked these folks later, there was about 50% that remembered the event that even like embellished it more. They're like, oh yeah, I remember grabbing Bugs's ears or like rubbing Bugs's arm, and the gray fur was like sticky because it was so hot that day. I mean, they like legitimately believe that it happened. That tells us really important things. And we hit on this a little bit earlier about memory, that we remember the broad strokes, but we do not remember the details because they're inconsequential. They don't really matter, right? Who you got a picture with could be important if you like had one character that you just were dying to get a picture with. But for the most of us, we're like, yeah, whatever. Like, I get a picture with somebody, Mickey or Minnie or somebody, Donald, I don't know. But we fill in the gaps with all of these things. We recreate the memory in our head, and we can even feel fairly confident about it. Now, what's the problem with this? Why can this like cause some pretty serious problems? Rach, what do you think?
Because they're not real memories.
Yeah. And how could that get us into heaps of trouble?
Well, I know in the book it talked about how it got, somebody was prosecuted for something, and they were trying to prove that he was innocent because they put the idea into his head. But he like embellished on how he had, I don't remember if he murdered somebody or something like that, but he gave like in-depth details about what happened and everything.
I think it was a lady saying her parents had like raped her or something like that, or her father. Then later found out that never happened.
Yeah. Well, and that's there. Those things are hard to prove, but I know of one case study where like the grandfather or father who had allegedly done the abuse,
That's what it was.
they alleged that it had happened, he was out of the country. But I mean, these things happen, right? That's why eyewitness testimony is actually, like, as it turns out, the worst, right? Because the questions that, let's say, the officer asks that person could totally change what they remember. And then if you have a bias, let's say, I think that people with blonde hair, because I can see Stacy and Andrea's hair, that I think with people with blonde hair are usually criminals. And the guy who's asking me questions says, was it somebody with blonde hair? Well, I might not have remembered that, but because of that bias, I might say, oh yeah, of course, because I remember and think that all people with blonde hair are criminals. They're just bad people. So it's really kind of sketchy, right? It's pretty unreliable to rely on our memories of these things. So we can, in fact, create false memories. This is her book. It's fantastic. The Myth of Repressed Memory. She did a whole lot of studies on this and continues to do it, especially focused on like this idea that you might remember getting abused, but you never remembered it your whole life, but suddenly you remember it in the last couple of months or something like that. Elizabeth Loftus, it's a quick read. It's a pretty good book, so I highly recommend that one. But remember that attention is selective, right? We've kind of already talked about that. We pay attention to certain things and not other things. All the information that comes through us is almost like a river that's running through us. And what we pay attention to is what we dip into that river. And that's the only things that stay with us. So we're out of time, but what I want to do is, I think, keep trying to make this information as relatable and personal as you possibly can. Because I think that'll help you the most to remember it. Now, we sort of started with sensory. We talked about attention. We're on working now. And working has the same thing. We have a capacity and a duration there. We have about 7 bits of information we can remember, plus or minus 2. And then we have a duration, which is about 18 to 20 seconds, that unless we rehearse it, it just disappears in our working memory. That's why like phone numbers are about 7 digits, right? Most of the time, because that's what we can comfortably remember in our working memory. And with rehearsal, then we encode it effectively into long-term memory. But we'll stop there, and let me see if you guys have any questions.
I don't.